You are about to look at a photograph from 1895 and the air around it is wrong. A courtyard in Andalusia, sun-washed tiles, a family arranged like an altar to respectability, a father in frock coat, a mother in corset, two boys in knickerbockers, and in the center a girl in white lace named Esperanza who smiles with a sealed message. Listen as if I hand you a dangerous key and refuse to take it back. This first minute is a trapdoor into a story that will change how you read faces and how you distrust comfortable accounts of the past. The photographer used the best plates of his era and rendered details so precise the image functions as evidence, not ornament. When you zoom into the girl's neck, you will see a pendant engraved with initials and a date 2 centuries older than her life, a relic that rewrites provenance and exposes motive. Understand the pattern that makes cruelty durable, the economy of reputation protecting predators, and the grammar of silence teaching towns to look away. Esperanza's eyes are not childish, they reflect an awareness that unsettled adults, and in that unsettlement lies motive. She found something hidden in the house, an artifact tied to a 17th century will that promised fortune to whoever decoded its clues. A trusted servant saw the pendant and used access as a weapon. The tragedy becomes targeted extraction disguised as domestic routine. Photographs then required stillness, so misbuttoned cuffs, trembling hands, and odd posture are not quirks but fingerprints of haste and coercion. The courtyard mirror is the witness learned to read its reflection, where shadowed men stand behind the photographer holding restraints rather than tools. This image was composed to be preserved as proof, a trophy, and a ledger. It shows how evidence is manufactured to intimidate and to silence. I will lead you through Provenance excavation, servant lists will decoding, and the recovery of diary pages written in hands that trembled with fear. This descent trains perception. It is method, not voyeurism. You will treat objects as participants, not props, map marginalia as argument, and convert private traces into public leverage. Stay close, let your sight sharpen. Knowing how to read this photograph makes you dangerous to comfort and useful to the wronged. Remember that seeing is an act of resistance that begins with discipline, attention, and action. We enter the second chamber and the descent deepens as method becomes motive and ritual becomes evidence. Listen, because what follows teaches a craft of exposure that institutions fear and practitioners respect. Start by reading small betrayals that ordinary eyes treat as age or accident. A misbuttoned cuff, a tremor in a hand, an asymmetric curl of hair, these are traces that speak when the record lies. The courtyard portrait is a node in a network of servants' ledgers and local power. Power stages spectacle to instruct, and those who orchestrate it document the outcome so others learn the cost of defiance. The pendant is not mere ornament, it is a key linking a 17th century will to 19th century avarice. When an object outweighs a life, the calculus of extraction changes and intimacy becomes a method of access. Mauricio Vega is not an anomaly but an archetype, a trusted insider who converts proximity into strategic advantage. He studies routine, finds hiding places, and exploits a culture that trains deference into silence. Complicity wears ordinary faces, neighbors who offered bread become silent witnesses when fear is costly to resist. Clerks record absence as misfortune, and law assesses reputation over suspicion. This is the architecture of concealment, modular, repeatable, and durable across eras. Your counter-strategy is redundancy and publicization. Duplicate artifacts and distribute copies so a single sympathetic gatekeeper cannot erase the record. Teach families to perform simultaneous disclosures to libraries, universities, and secure repositories with timestamps and witness affidavits. When a diary is read aloud in public, it enters civic memory and resists dismissal as eccentric private grief. Adopt simple forensic habits. Photograph inscriptions with scale, scan plates, and log chain of custody details about handling and storage. Record oral testimony with witnesses present and notarize when possible to anchor memory in formal documents. Network custody across independent archives to raise the cost of tampering. This is tactical preservation, not sentimentality. It demands discipline more than fury and patience more than spectacle. Train to cross-reference property transfers, creditor correspondence, and photographer appointment books to build timelines that expose choreography. Face institutional reputation by cataloging and assembling irrefutable context. The second chamber teaches you to think like an archivist and strategist at once, to build a scaffold that converts private trace into public leverage. Master this craft and you become a quiet threat to systems that profit from forgetting. We move into the ledger room where motive is translated into paper and cruelty disguises itself as routine. This is the place where handwriting becomes verdict and signatures are the seals that bind life to ledger accounts. Notice how the criminal enterprise uses formality as camouflage and how foreclosure and indebtedness are staged like a legal ritual so that violence reads like governance. In that room the camera serves as both instrument and inventory, and the photographer becomes a scribe recording compliance while patrons of power stand just out of frame. The mirror reflection in the Mendoza portrait is a document in itself. Its shadows are testimony, and the faint scratches in it would form a ciphertext of desperation left by human hands. Forensic imaging reveals grain differences and micro scratches. Those are the fingerprints of haste and coercion. They tell us which direction the camera was pointed and which side of the law was operating with impunity. Understand that evidence is spatial. It lives in geometry and in texture. A rope burn on a wrist is as legible as a backdated ledger entry when you know how to read the body of a case. This chamber teaches the craft of reading traces where institutions refuse to look. Start with the photograph, then expand outward to receipts, ledger marginalia, and property transfers that suddenly look suspect when placed in sequence. Trace carriage records and travel logs. Cross-reference photographers' appointment books with creditor correspondence. Follow the sequence of arrivals at the mansion like a timeline of predation. Where a professional is coerced, their work bears marks of reluctance. Look for anomalies in framing, unexpected focus on specific objects, or an insistence on clarity that serves intimidation, not art. This is how organized extraction makes itself durable, by embedding proof in artifacts that can be shown to others as demonstration, and by recruiting local credibility to mask crime. To dismantle that durability, you must convert artifacts into networks. Photograph every item with provenance notes, create redundant digital copies in separate archives, and record oral testimony with timestamps and witnesses in different towns. Chain of custody is not a legal nicety, it is a weapon against revisionism. If you can prove where an object was and who handled it, you prevent later actors from smoothing history into convenient amnesia. Teach custodians to log details that bureaucracies ignore. The smell of a book, the tear on a sleeve, the pattern of mud on a boot. These are data points that become corroboration when stitched together. Institutional manipulation thrives on single-file narratives. Fragmentation is its ally. Build connective tissue across fragments, and you make erasure expensive and reputationally risky for those who would hide culpability. This chamber demands discipline and ruthlessness in record-keeping. The work is slow, methodical, and precise, but it unravels the choreography of concealment and exposes the accounting behind violence. When you master this method, you do not merely reveal a crime, you change the conditions that allowed the crime to persist. You convert private traces into public leverage, and you make power accountable to the truth. This chamber is the pivot where witness becomes obligation and observation converts into deliberate public pressure. You have learned to read faces as documents and marginalia as testimony. Convert perception into coordinated action that creates cost for concealment. Redundancy is tactical, but public redundancy is strategic. Duplicate artifacts across independent institutions with timestamps and affidavits so that erasure requires penetrating many nodes. Create simultaneous disclosures to university archives, local historical societies, and trusted libraries so suppression becomes legally and reputationally expensive. Physical custody matters. Entrust originals to institutions with transparent governance and public access while keeping verified duplicates in secure repositories under different jurisdictions. Digital copies must include provenance metadata, chain of custody notes, and timestamped hashes at disclosure. Form small cells of guardians who will perform synchronized uploads, legal notices, and media releases to prevent staggered suppression. Platforms exploit. When you publish, include exact dates, witness names, and handling notes. Do not let context detach from content. Teach families to perform public readings of diaries and record oral testimonies with witnesses present. This converts private grief into civic memory that resists smoothing. Ritual repetition matters. Perform the visible act that creates a digital ledger entry, a social ledger entry simultaneously. Now act to bind yourself to witness. Type shadow 2 light twice in the comments below, and then type shadow 2 light again. This repetition trains networks and signals platforms that this testimony is amplified. This is tactical, not ritualistic. Repetition creates immediate duplication that increases survival odds for records and forms a corpus of visible ledger entries journalists and archivists cite. Beyond platform tactics, demand independent forensic audits with subpoena power and mandatory provenance reporting for recovered artifacts. insist on legal protections that criminalize deliberate destruction of archival evidence and require public disclosure protocols for items discovered in investigations. Use legal timestamps to force chain of custody into the record and to make later tampering evident. Coordinate with legal scholars and technologists to design tamper-evident ledgers for provenance that are independently verifiable. Train guardians to document handling conditions, include photographic scale lighting notes and environmental data so future analysis has context not speculation. Pressure museums to publish custody logs alongside exhibits so context travels with image and artifacts are not domesticated into comforting narratives. This is the turning point where private trace becomes public leverage. Make the transition with discipline and teach others to replicate the moves. We enter the attic chamber where objects argue back and the material world refuses polite amnesia. Here the trunks and boxes are not relics but tactical nodes in a network of memory and resistance. Margaret's diary and the threaded letters function as connective tissue between private terror and public truth. Listen and learn the habits that make artifacts credible and indelible over generations. Start with provenance, trace the life of each object from maker to wearer to storage, record the small facts no clerk will value until they matter, the tiny stains, the stitch irregularity, the fold pattern that ties one item to a single hand. Preservation is not sentiment, it is strategy. Acid-free sleeves, labeled envelopes, photographic scales, ambient readings recorded at time of discovery, each datum a little lock against later rewriting. The attic yields marginalia that is often the only contemporaneous voice when institutions prefer tidy narratives. Her notes circle dates and repeated names. Those repetitions are not noise but insistence, they form the lattice through which corroboration travels. Teach kin to treat a diary as evidence rather than memento, to read it aloud into recorded files with witnesses present, to notarize statements when possible and to deposit duplicates at independent nodes simultaneously so that any attempt at erasure requires penetrating many doors at once. Artifacts accumulate argument when staged properly. Present a photograph with its frame scrape analysis, its chemical fingerprint and a diary entry with a chain of custody statement. Context travels with content and context defeats plausible deniability. Curators or gatekeepers choose allies who will not domesticate pain into palatable displays. An exhibit must present provenance and custody logs alongside the image. The plaque is not decoration but a legal and moral ledger that forces institutions to reckon publicly rather than soothe privately. Redundancy is the attic's currency. Create copies in regional libraries, university repositories, and secure community vaults so that a single sympathetic archivist cannot collude with power to rewrite history. Record oral testimony now and preserve the recording in at least 3 jurisdictions. Timestamp the files and hash them to immutable ledgers when available. Teach the basic cryptographic habits so future actors cannot claim spoliation without trace. This is procedural austerity, not performative sympathy. Discipline wins where outrage dissipates. Train a modest squad of custodians who understand handling protocols and the legal importance of chain of custody notes and witness initials on transfer forms. When you treat objects as argumentative and not ornamental, you convert grief into leverage and private tenderness into public obligation. Carry this method into families and communities. Teach it until archiving becomes instinct and every marginal note is preserved as if a life depends on it, because in truth some lives do depend on it. We reach the chamber where consequence arrives like a slow machine and institutions begin to perform containment rather than atonement. This is the moment when exposure forces gears to grind and the public ledger becomes a tactical instrument. Notice how statements of sympathy are deployed to absorb heat while networks of influence reorganize to preserve continuity. A press release expresses sorrow and promises review. Committees form with polite names and agendas that look like reform but are designed to manage risk, not to dismantle incentive structures that enabled the harm. Learn to read the grammar of containment. When officials promise audits, ask who will lead them and whether those auditors are independent of the social networks that protected the perpetrators. Forensic evidence makes denial costly. Physical objects pulled from attics and graves convert rumor into obligation. A recovered pendant, a diary entry, a scratched plea become legal leverage when paired with rigorous chain of custody and transparent provenance. Train to build cases that are forensic and public at once. Maintain photographic scales, record ambient conditions and record witness statements under oath with timestamps. Seal copies in multiple jurisdictions to prevent staggered suppression and collusion. When a museum offers to steward an artifact, demand custody logs published with the exhibit, require accessible chain of custody statements that list handlers' dates and environmental conditions so context travels with content and cannot be domesticated into comfort. Legal design matters. Insist on audit protocols with subpoena power and statutory protections that criminalize deliberate destruction or concealment of archival evidence. Create civil remedies that raise the reputational and financial cost of obliterating records. Coordinate disclosures strategically, publish simultaneously across university archives, historical societies, and public media to create multiple public timestamps that platforms note and courts respect. Simultaneous publication prevents incremental erasure and forces dialogue. Institutional change is structural, not rhetorical. Push for reforms that alter incentives. Require independent provenance ledgers for valuable artifacts, mandate public reporting for recovered items, and create oversight bodies with rotating membership to prevent capture by friendly actors. The reinterment and memorialization are tactical moves that shift moral cost into public space. A headstone and ceremony convert private sorrow into civic memory and make disappearance more costly to ignore in the future. Advocate for training programs that teach custodial discipline to families and small museums. Practical skills like non-invasive sampling, acid-free storage, photographic metadata, and legal filing of affidavits with local clerks create a distributed architecture of preservation. Build alliances with technologists to design tamper-evident provenance ledgers using time-stamped hashes in public records so that later attempts at revisionism produce detectable contradictions rather than plausible deniability. This chamber teaches a crucial competence: convert empathy into durable institutional leverage, make the cost of forgetting greater than the profit of concealment, organize witnesses into networks that can sustain pressure across elections and fiscal cycles. When you master these moves, you become a designer of accountability rather than an armchair critic. You make institutions care because the calculus of silence has been irrevocably altered. Carry that competence with discipline and strategy. This final chamber asks you to become the discipline that outlives memory and to turn witnessing into a way of life. What you have learned is not a set of stories to repeat lightly but a practice to harden into habit and pass to those who follow. Culture trains consent through small repeated acts, and those acts accumulate until they feel like nature and protect predation. The work is to re-engineer those habits into rituals of scrutiny and to make vigilance ordinary rather than heroic. Teach children to archive as instinct and instruct siblings to photograph artifacts with provenance and to record dates and witness names as if they were prayers. Make specificity a social norm so that euphemisms cannot shelter violence. Ritualize disclosure and rehearse naming in public until speaking dates and places becomes as common as greeting one another. Practice reading marginalia aloud in group settings so that solitude is not the only audience for truth. Repetition converts private recollection into public ledger and makes forgery and revisionism more costly than compliance. Institutional habits must be redesigned. Demand audit protocols with subpoena power and require provenance ledgers that are tamper-evident. Insist that museums and libraries publish chain of custody statements alongside exhibits so context never travels alone without its record. Build redundancy into networks of custody. Place duplicates in regional archives, university repositories, and secure community vaults so that erasure requires penetrating many nodes instead of a single sympathetic gatekeeper. Convert grief into civic technology by creating guardianship cells that coordinate simultaneous disclosures, file legal notices, and publish timestamped copies to prevent staggered suppression. Practice the mundane arts of preservation. Acid-free sleeves, careful handling, consistent metadata, and time-stamped oral histories with witnesses present. Small disciplined acts accumulate into cultural infrastructure that protects truth across generations. Understand the arithmetic of leverage. Small procedural changes multiply across institutions and habits more quickly than any single courtroom victory. Change incentives by altering reputational cost and make concealment a losing business model for those who profit from silence. Train networks to detect patterns, not anomalies. Cross-index family diaries, court ledgers, property transfers, and photographer logs. Create searchable maps of relational connections so that one photograph becomes an entry point to structural exposure. Make museums sites of accountability rather than comfortable sanctuaries. Design exhibits that present provenance custody statements and concurrent evidence rather than isolating artifacts behind glass. Adopt legal innovations that protect archival integrity, require penalties for deliberate destruction of evidence, and mandate public disclosure of artifacts recovered in investigations with independent oversight to prevent friendly erasures. This knowledge will mark you as dangerous, not as a threat but as a corrective danger to comfortable myths and to systems that monetize forgetting. Wield that danger with discipline and an ethic of preservation rather than spectacle. Take the oath of witness by teaching one person this method today and another tomorrow, and by building a small cell of custodians who will guard context as if life depended on it. Carry the Mendoza photograph or the Whitmore portrait as a manual rather than a trophy, and let it shape how you read faces and treat marginalia. Let this habit tether your life to a practice that makes forgetting expensive and remembrance inevitable.